Hello. So I would like to continue my Prime Minister series. Before I do that, today has been a very eventful news day. So I want to touch on a few of the things that have happened. Um, Firstly, terrible news from Turkey. It's too early to say who was responsible for this terrorist attack in Ankara, but it's truly shocking. Took place at a peace rally of all things, and I think I've always made the point that as soon as any group deliberately targets civilians, they've lost all moral credibility whatsoever. The reports are at present 86 dead. That will likely rise. Dozens injured. It's truly despicable, and it's the worst terrorist attack in modern Turkish history, even surpassing the 2003 Istanbul bombings. This took place in Ankara, and I believe, Turkey's declared a day of national mourning. So that's despicable. There's also been a tragedy in the Republic of Ireland. 10 people killed at Romani traveller site in Dublin. Not much, I haven't seen much news on that, but I understand it was from a fire. Um, North Korea's had a big military parade today marking 70 years since the end of World War II, which of course was an opportunity for the regime to show off its weapons. And the other big news today, at least in Britain, is the death of Geoffrey Howe. This comes only a week after Denis Healey. Geoffrey Howe served as Chancellor of the Exchequer and as Foreign Secretary under Margaret Thatcher. He was one of the Tory grandees, so to speak, of the party. He was 88 years old. Um, David Cameron said of him he was a very kind and thoughtful man. Those on the left, of course, would say that he's closely associated with Thatcherism, and under his watch, unemployment rose, and he's very much seen as one of the leading figures of Thatcherism, so obviously a controversial figure in that regard. But that's the news today. I thought I'd put that at the end as it's obviously political related. So Geoffrey Howe is now at 88. Obviously, the ministers of that sort of generation, I'm talking 60s, 70s, 80s, are all getting much older now. So fewer and fewer of them left. Geoffrey Howe, incidentally, and I'll mention it in the Thatcher video, but one of the reasons he is well known is because his resignation from her cabinet, he could no longer work with her, was widely considered to have prompted her own resignation 3 weeks later in 1990. So that's Geoffrey Howe, died today at the age of 88. Okay, so to move on, I've come up to Prime Minister number 42, Clement Attlee. Um, and if you would just excuse me very briefly, I'm going to get a glass of water. Okay, thank you for waiting. So Clement Attlee came to Downing Street in 1945 and he served until 1951, about 6 years. Um, he's widely venerated within the Labour Party and amongst the British left in general, and is widely regarded as one of our greatest prime ministers, although he's a lot less of a profile figure than Churchill was. I think that's fair to say, internationally speaking, certainly. And that's in large part due to the contrasting characters of the two men. Um, anyway, I'll just give a bit of the biographical, then move on to talk about Attlee himself. Um, he was born in 1883 in Putney, which lay in Surrey, now part of South London. Um, and he came out to office in 1945. He would have been, I believe, 61 at that time, so one of our older prime ministers. Um, and this is the article from the 10 Downing Street webpage. Clement Attlee was leader of the Labour Party from 1935 to 1955. That makes him by far Labour's longest serving leader, and served as Britain's Prime Minister from 45 to 51. As Prime Minister, he enlarged and improved social services and the public sector in post-war Britain, creating the National Health Service and nationalising major industries and public utilities. Attlee's government also presided over the decolonization of India, Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, and Jordan, and saw the creation of the State of Israel from Britain's withdrawal from Palestine. Born to a middle-class family in London, Clement Attlee studied at Oxford University and then trained as a lawyer. He went on to manage Haileybury House, a charitable youth organisation in Limehouse, East London. This experience clearly had a profound impact on Attlee, whose political views were shaped by the poverty he witnessed in London's East End, and in 1908 he joined the Independent Labour Party. This was before it was organised as the Labour Party we know today. Upon the advent of the First World War, he applied for a commission and served as a captain. His reputation as an effective, efficient leader gained him promotion to the rank of major, a title that would stay with him beyond his military life. In fact, very often in his political life, he was known as Major Attlee. On returning from the war, Attlee moved into politics, becoming Mayor of Stepney in 1919 and MP for Limehouse in 1922. He continued to rise within the Labour Party and was elected its leader in 1935, following the resignation of George Lansbury. During the Second World War, he was called into Winston Churchill's coalition government, notably holding the title of Deputy Prime Minister from 42 to 45. Bear in mind this was a coalition. When a general election was called at the peak of the war in Europe, Attlee led the Labour Party to a surprising landslide victory, winning 393 seats to the Conservatives' 213, 48% of the public vote. That election was incredible. It was one of the biggest landslides in British history and one of the biggest surprises in British history in many ways. You would think that Churchill, having won the war, would have cruised in the number 10 after that, but there's a common saying that goes something like this: people cheered Churchill and voted for Attlee, or they cheered Churchill and voted for Labour. That is to say that they had a huge amount of respect for Churchill, but the Tories were associated with the war. People wanted to move on. Also, domestically speaking, Labour was in a stronger position. Um, People probably trusted Labour more from a domestic perspective at this point. Attlee's period as Prime Minister was one of intense activity. The notoriously blunt, relatively quiet man was nevertheless very skilled at quick, decisive action. His leadership style was apparently collective, but once the Prime Minister let his cabinet voice their opinions, he would quickly make decisions with military precision. As a result, practically all of Labour's manifesto pledges were implemented under Attlee. Despite the Second World War leaving Britain effectively bankrupt, he managed the creation of the National Health Service, part of the welfare state that sought to provide cradle-to-the-grave care for British citizens. On top of this, many of Britain's largest industries, such as coal mining, electricity, and the railways, were brought under state control, despite recurring currency crises and shortages of food and resources so severe that rationing had to be maintained long after the war. It was around this time, for example, British Railways were created, and that lasted until 1994. Attlee's time as Prime Minister also saw intense foreign political activity. He placed great faith in Ernest Bevin, his Foreign Secretary, and together they oversaw Indian independence, American loans and Marshall aid for the rebuilding of Britain and Western Europe, the Berlin airlift, and Britain's commitment to the United Nations. In the 1950 general election, Labour lost its majority, and by the time of its defeat in the general election of 1951, the Labour government had worked itself to near exhaustion. Attlee, however, continued to lead the Labour Party until 1955 and died in 1967 at the age of 84. More than one survey of academics has voted Attlee the most successful British Prime Minister of all time. Some of the major acts in his time was the National Health Service Act of 1946. That's very closely associated with Aneurin Bevan, his minister who has been called the greatest Welshman. And Bevan is an equally revered figure within the Labour Party. That made healthcare free on the basis of citizenship and need rather than the payment of fees or insurance premiums. And it's still very much a British institution. The NHS is something that is widely revered in this country, and it's got a almost sacred position. For right or wrong, that is the way it is. National Insurance Act of 1946 introduced Social Security, in which persons of working age had to pay a weekly contribution and in return were entitled to a wide range of benefits when they could no longer work. Coal Industry Nationalisation Act 46, the Electricity Act of 47, the Transport Act of 47, which nationalised the coal industry, electricity, utilities, railways, and long-distance haulage. The Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, planning permission now required for land development, ownership alone no longer sufficient. The Children Act of 1948 established a comprehensive childcare service, reforming services provided care to deprived and orphaned children. The Nurseries and Childminders Regulation Act of 1948, which paid childminders, now registered and regulated, inspection regime in place to check their methods and facilities to meet basic minimum standards. The National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act 1949 allowed the creation of national parks and areas of outstanding national beauty. The closest one to here is the Northumberland National Park in England and Wales, gave the public rights and way of access to open land. He nationalised 1/5 of the British economy. Um, well, that's go take a breath now. So, as you can see from this, Attlee had a very, very proactive government, and he is largely credited for creating the Britain that we know today, to a large extent. Critics of the Tories would say that Thatcher dismantled a lot of that. But nevertheless, Attlee's government really was incredibly proactive. No matter what your views, I don't think anyone could dispute that. This was, of course, just after World War II. Um, at the time of the general election 45, World War II was actually still going on, especially the war in the Far East. So it was Attlee, not Churchill, who presided over the Potsdam Conference. Um, the Attlee-Churchill working relationship was an interesting one, because both men had a very differing personality. Attlee was very reserved and very humble. Churchill once, perhaps rather cruelly, quoted, "He's much to be humble about." But um, academics have considered Attlee one of our top prime ministers. In fact, in 2004, Ipsos Mori got a poll of 139 academics, and in that poll, he was ranked as our greatest prime minister. And even when he's not ranked as the greatest, he's almost always in the top five. So he's a very, very highly respected figure, especially within the Labour Party. But even I think most Conservatives have some respect for him in the way that most Labour people would have some respect for Churchill. Attlee was unquestionably a great man, and yet his personality, he was a very quiet spoken man. He never, even in the interviews, and there's many British Cafe videos of him online. He wasn't a great orator. He wasn't a grandiose figure, but his achievements really were profound. Um, he, it says Wikipedia, the government he led built a post-war consensus based upon the assumption that full employment would be maintained by Commission policies. Um, and these were aspirations that had been outlined by the Wartime Beveridge Report. I think one of the strengths of the Attlee government was that some of the people in it were also very notable in their own right. People like an Iron Bevan, for example, Ernest Bevan, spelt with Bevin, Bevan's Bevan, so the two Bevans. Stafford Cripps, a young Harold Wilson. It was a very strong cabinet. Um, Attlee's time also saw the beginning of the Cold War. And when the Cold War was very intense, the Berlin airlift, for example, um, and decolonization process, India and Pakistan became independent. That was part of the pledge that Churchill and they had they helped out in the war effort, then independence would be granted. And of course, a very bloody period of partition. The creation of the State of Israel, still probably one of the more controversial aspects of the Attlee administration. Certainly a very, very busy time in world affairs. And 1951, it didn't mention it in the article, but the beginning of the Korean War. And whereas Churchill was associated with his cigars, Attlee was always associated with his pipe, much like Harold Wilson later on. I also think it's fair to say that whilst the Attlee administration gets a lot of credit for creating the welfare state, and they deserve that credit, I think they were partly building on a basis, groundwork that had been created by Campbell Bannerman, Asquith, and Lloyd George. And I think the Labour Party need to acknowledge that. Sorry if I'm sounding political here, but it was Campbell Bannerman, Asquith, and Lloyd George that had laid the groundwork for the modern welfare state. what Attlee done was really built on it and built on it in a very energetic way. Um, he died, incidentally, I usually mention the place where the prime ministers pass away. He died in Westminster Hospital. He was 84. Um, Given his prestige in British politics, given his influence, he's not as well known a figure as Churchill. Certainly, there's been a lot fewer books, although there has been one just released. I'll try and find out the name of that. It's just been published. Um, I believe this is, if you just bear with me a second. Um, but generally speaking, he isn't, certainly not internationally as famous. I mean, I would say the average person, yes, so Clement Attlee, political biography. Oh, that's 1986. I'm trying to find a new one. Yes, Clement Attlee, The Inevitable Prime Minister. This is by Michael Jago, and that's just been published in 2014. I'd like to get my hands on that one. I think it is fair to say that whilst he's hugely revered within the Labour Party, and incidentally, if you ever go to the Durham Miners Gala, it's a very important cultural, political event near where I live, usually they have a banner showing Attlee. He was never a miner, he was never a mine leader, but he's a revered socialist figure. And yet he was a very English socialist in the sense that he wasn't a firebrand Marxist. He was very much an Englishman. You know, he was very happy with a cup of tea, chatting to his constituents. So he had that sort of reputation. Major Attlee. He was also, despite being a figure of the left, staunch patriot. He loved his country, and um, sometimes there's an unfair portrayal of those on the left as being anti-British. Well, I don't think anyone can accuse Attlee of being anti-British. Um, so he was a pivotal historical figure. There's been relatively few films about Attlee, or at least featuring Attlee, and none that I can think of off the top of my head. I'll just have a quick look in a Wikipedia article. Incidentally, when he was called to the palace, I believe he had a good relationship with King George VI because both men had a similar personality. George VI, like Attlee, had a very reserved personality. Um, This is not to say, of course, that his administration was without its faults or without its blunders. In 1940, 48, 49, I believe, there was a devastating winter that year, and the government did face a bit of fallout from that for a lot of the problems that came about from that. Um, just trying to find Attlee if he's been featured in film. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but incidentally, there was two elections, 50 and 51. There's a statue to him outside Limehouse Library. Um, Although one of his brothers became a clergyman and his sister's a missionary, Attlee himself was regarded as agnostic and he rarely spoke about his religion. I'm actually trying to find. He was painted by the famous Scottish artist Cowan Dobson, who also later painted Harold Wilson. Trying to find something on. Yeah, he was played by Patrick Troughton in Edward and Mrs. Simpson. Um, but really, there isn't much mention of him in films, and that's a bit of a pity, I think. Um, Played by Alan David in the final episode of the BBC sitcom Goodnight Sweetheart. He was played by his grandson, Richard Attlee, in the TV series Dunkirk in 2004. Played by Bill Patterson in Into the Storm 2009. But I can't think of any feature films that he was played in, and that's a great pity, I think. Anyway, that is Clement Attlee. One of our greatest prime ministers, a figure who's revered among within the Labour Party, and a man who had a very, very turbulent administration. Clement Attlee.